Welcome to episode 130 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. And this time I'm going to talk about the Beatles' classic release from 1965, Rubber Soul. And this is the Canadian/American version of this album on Capitol Records. This is the first Canadian pressing of that. Talking about transitional albums for the Beatles is kind of tricky, but if you're going to pick one big transition, it's between the period of the pop rockers of the Beatlemania period to the reclusive, studio-bound experimenters of the later 1960s. And you get inklings of that transition on Help. It's largely complete by Revolver in 1966, but it's on this album, Rubber Soul, where the transition is really happening. In the great tradition of Capitol Records in the States butchering UK releases of Beatle albums to produce a slightly different song lineup, this is no different. And this version omits Drive My Car, Nowhere Man, What Goes On, and If I Needed Someone. But the substitutions are noteworthy ones because in come I've Just Seen a Face and It's Only Love, a total of 12 songs as opposed to 14 songs on the UK version. By the late summer of 1965, the Beatles had been on top of the pop world for the better part of 2 years. They toured the US in the summer of 1965, and when they got back to the UK, they were being pressured by their management to put out a new album for Christmas, which was what they always did. Well, always. They had done for the last 2 or 3 years. That tour in the summer of 65 had been quite influential. Not only had they heard a whole bunch of great soul music in the States, they'd also met the Byrds and Bob Dylan. Dylan, of course, was increasingly a hero for the Beatles, and particularly for John, who wanted to escape the kind of cliched Moon, June, Spoon love song stuff they had been writing and move towards more Dylan-esque themes. And of course, famously, they also got high with him in New York. The story behind that is kind of funny. Apparently, when they got together in the hotel, Dylan wanted just to drink cheap wine, but they didn't have any cheap wine because classically, Brian Epstein said, "We only have champagne," which is such a Brian Epstein thing to say. Dylan then says, "Well, let's smoke weed." So he pulls out a joint and he hands it to John, and John looks at the joint and gives it to Ringo and tells Dylan that Ringo is his royal taster. So Ringo then lights up the joint, not having smoked one, well, for a long time. They had tried a little bit of weed in Germany 5 years before. Smokes the whole thing end to end like a cigarette and gets ridiculously high, as does Epstein. McCartney himself felt that he had achieved some kind of enlightenment. Anyway, from that point on, the Beatles ended up binging on a lot of weed. And in fact, Lennon has referred to this album as the pot album. So the Beatles come home inspired by all these incredible artists and are also highly influenced by the amazing sounds that are coming out of American recording studios. And they want to kind of break the shackles and take control. Rubber Soul was done in about a month. There were about 13 days of actual recording, and it was the first time when the Beatles weren't trying to jam their recording sessions in and amongst their touring schedule. So although a month is not that long of a time, this was a relatively relaxed and focused session of recording for the Beatles, and it shows, I think, in the output. Funnily enough, they came into this recording session with not enough songs for a full record, and so they had to do a lot of writing while in the studio. It is amazing in retrospect to reflect on the quality of the songs they came up with in such a short time, and not just songs which made it on this record, but songs which didn't even make the cut, which were released as singles, songs like We Can Work It Out and Day Tripper, which were also recorded during these sessions. As I mentioned, they arrived at the studio in a spirit of experimentation, and they took full advantage of the fact that EMI had this incredible warehouse full of obscure musical instruments. So one of the things they pulled out of that was, of course, a harmonium, which is this strange harmonica-sounding miniature organ. Anyway, we'll talk about that in a bit. Befitting the focus on doing different things lyrically than they had done before, the lyrics really are different in this record. They are still largely about love, but it's much less kind of naive boy-girl stuff and much more kind of mid-relationship struggles and irony and reflective and very kind of personal themes, much more so. You get much more of a window into the personal lives of the Beatles here than anything you got on the previous 4 or 5 albums. Side 1 of the North American version here starts with I've Just Seen a Face. Routinely, this song has been in my top 5 Beatles songs. I think it is just a piece of brilliant McCartney pop magic from the very beginning to the very end, and everything about it, from the breathless delivery to the harmonies to the shimmering, beautiful sound of the acoustic guitar, is just 2 minutes of pure, unbridled pop delight. That's followed this wonderful 1-2 punch of this record by Norwegian Wood, which of course is about a fling John had and couldn't really be that frank about, so he kind of bowdlerizes it for the lyrics of this song. And of course is the first appearance of a sitar on a Beatle record. And I would say that with this song, the second half of the 1960s begins. It's It's tough to maintain the standards the first two songs have set. The third song is by Paul. It's You Won't See Me, which is a song about his relationship with Jane Asher. It's not the last time that relationship gets an airing on this album. It is, I think, relative to the first two songs, a little bit more pedestrian. Then we have George's outing, Think for Yourself. This is notable for a couple of reasons. I think most people notice the fuzz bass, which Paul uses, which is really quite distinctive. But the more interesting thing here, I think, is George's use of melody, particularly in the verses, which are very non-Western sounding, and I think pretty clearly evidence of the influence of some of the Indian music he was listening to. After all, McGuinn and Crosby had introduced him not just to the sitar, but to the music of Ravi Shankar. This is not the tentative George of past albums. This is now somebody starting to find his voice, and it's kind of exciting. That's followed by The Word, which is probably the first flower power song that the Beatles ever did, at least lyrically. This is the piece which has the aforementioned harmonium played by George Martin. Side one closes out with Michelle, which is a song which Paul had actually written in the late 1950s, and it was not really complete until John wrote a middle eight, a bridge for it, which was, of course, was very typical of how the two of them wrote. And once he did that, the whole song came together. Side 2 kicks off with It's Only Love, which is the other song which they culled from the Help sessions. This is a song which John wrote and sang and which John hated. And it's true, I think the rhymes are a little bit cringy and not the kind of Dylan-esque vibe he was going for. But I've always thought that the vocal performance in the choruses here is incredible and so powerful and not really something that he in any way should have been ashamed of. But an even better effort from John on the next song, which is Girl. This is the very last song they cut for the record. Often with Lennon, all the way through his career, you get glimpses into what is basically a troubled relationship with women. Sometimes in Lennon's lyrics you get the insecure and introspective John. Sometimes you get the violent and angrier and more judgmental John. This is kind of more the former. And it's kind of remarkable for those of us who are just regular folks to see, John Lennon in 1965, a man who was arguably the most eligible bachelor in the world, not in any way feeling comfortable in his relationships, feeling like he was constantly chasing, judging, troubled, and so on. I think on top of all this is a spectacular vocal performance by John. On the next song, John's relationship with women takes a backseat to Paul's relationship, again with Jane Asher. I'm Looking Through You is basically Paul working through some of the various stages of grief with respect to her pursuing her own film career and not really being super deferential, and this wasn't really turning his crank. And he's wringing his hands about that and basically exiting the relationship live in this song. The next song is In My Life, which is a piece of total John Lennon genius in my book. This is a song which was inspired by Smokey Robinson and the Miracles and Tracks of My Tears and that kind of stuff. But it's a Lennon song right at its core. It's detached, it's emotional, it's cynical, it's sentimental, all these things at the same time. George Martin does not actually play a harpsichord. He actually plays a piano. What they did was they slowed the tape down to half speed, and then it's played back at normal speed, and you get that kind of jangling harpsichord-like sound. That's been remarked on a lot. I think what doesn't get as much notice in this song, which I think is actually central to it, is the quality of Ringo's drumming, which is so sympathetic. The second last song is Wait, and this is an old school Beatles tune which could have existed on any of the previous 3 or 4 records. The last song is Run for Your Life. This is the other side of John's relationship with women. This is the angry, stocky, threatening side. It is not aged well. It wasn't great when it came out. To his credit, he distanced himself from this song later in his career. It's also, I would say, the most knocked off and frankly uninteresting musically of all the songs on the record in any event. So it's kind of one to skip. Thankfully, it occurs at the very end of the second side. As I said at the start, this is a transitional album for the Beatles, perhaps the transitional album. And as such, it's pretty much got something for everybody. My dad, from whom I inherited my love of the Beatles, was a total Fab Four aficionado. He totally wore out his copies of Beatles for Sale and A Hard Day's Night. And there was lots of that classic Beatle energy and innocence on this record. But you also have the edgier lyrics and the trippier sounds that would appeal to fans of the later Beatles. So all these things are there. It's an amazing record musically, but it's also a fascinating snapshot of a band at a particular moment, basically drawing breath and taking stock of all they had seen and all they had learned in the past couple of years. It's got 4, what I would say are all-world Beatles songs and a whole bunch of other minor classics. You have to, I think, dock it a little bit for Run for Your Life, but at least they had the decency to place that at the end. And for me, this is 4.5 out of 5 stars.